The science-based method to remembering everything you've learned was developed by top cognitive psychologists and made into a best-selling book. But I've packaged the whole thing in this video so we can start using it right now, with the number one rule to remembering anything being that you need to value it. If you don't think something's important, your brain is going to toss it out like yesterday's trash, the same way it does to the faces of the countless strangers you pass on the street. And so the answer our ancestors came up with in order to get themselves to value an idea was repetition. The theory goes that by repeatedly reading a text, you will eventually have it memorized by heart. This is the oldest, most well-known and widely used method for memorization. But it's also the absolute worst, with the highest inefficiency and the least effectiveness imaginable. Instead, there are 3 techniques that will guarantee what you've learned stick with you for life. But before we get to any of them, let's talk about why the way you've been trying to remember things simply sucks. Back in school, we were told to read, reread, highlight, and cram as much information into our heads as possible. And sure, you might ace a test and even remember it for a day or two, but a week later, that information is gone, and you're back to square one. This happens because we're working against our own nature here. You see, if you ranked all the functions your brain is designed to handle, memory and recall wouldn't even crack the top 4. The brain is actually built to forget most things, unless it's forced to remember. But traditional memorization exercises fail in doing that because they miss the 2 cornerstones for strengthening memory. It's easy to understand if you imagine your memory as a muscle, and your studying sessions are your time in the gym. You repeating the same material for the bazillionth time in an hour is equivalent to the guy who aimlessly runs cycles through the machines in the gym. You're not only wasting time and energy, but even more importantly, you're losing out on the progress, the gains. Just like a muscle, your memory needs both a challenge and time to rest in order to grow stronger. But repetition past a certain point is detrimental for both, as you end up going through the motions bored out of your own mind and without no time to solidify the information. Whereas reading a line once and trying to remember what it was 10 minutes later is unbelievably more effective. As studies show that the harder a memory is to retrieve, the stronger it becomes, if recovery takes place properly. Meaning if you try to recall something you learned just when you're about to forget it, or you're barely able to remember it, then that memory will end up sticking for longer. But the importance of recovery cannot be overstated here. Sleep is the time when your brain decides what to keep stored and what to discard. It's when the connections between neurons are strengthened and new information gets reviewed, ensuring that memories are organized and enhancing your overall ability to learn and remember. And so in order to maximize on these 2 factors, the most foundational and crucial technique was created, called spaced retrieval. Spaced retrieval is done by actively recalling previously learned information and increasing the time interval between each new session. The idea is to let your brain almost forget the information before forcing it to recall it. The small struggle itself strengthens synaptic connections in order to perfect the retrieval process for the next time. So you in turn increase the difficulty by spacing the retrieval sessions further and further apart. Less wasted time and 10x the results. It challenges you, and the harder it gets, the better you become. The easiest way to use this right now is to ask ChatGPT to create a studying schedule that uses spaced retrieval on the topic you're most interested in at the moment. I made a prompt for you to use plus an example inside of a Google document. Both are linked down in the description. But a technique that's a lot easier to use yet somehow even less known is elaboration. It is the act of linking new information to things you already know. Let's say you're learning about the planets. Instead of just memorizing names, you could for example associate Uranus, the coldest planet, with something like Christmas. The goal here is to give the information depth and meaning. In this case, the image of Uranus might pop into your head the moment you hear jingle bells. By relating the new concept to something you're already familiar with, you're creating a mental web that makes it easier for your brain to grab onto the information. This works because your brain loves stories. and enjoys finding patterns and creating connections. And so the more meaning you attach to what you're learning, the more your brain will value it. That's what the third technique is great at, but it also has, in my opinion, the most potential for fun. I like to call it the do-it-yourself method, but it's officially called generation. Simply put, whenever you're faced with a new problem that you aren't equipped to handle just yet, try it anyways. Don't read an explanation or ask for help. Just give it your best shot. It might sound like a waste of time, but what happens when you try to generate a solution from what you already know is that you transition from a passive reader/listener to an active doer. And believe me, if you get the right answer, the serotonin will have you buzzing for a good minute. But more importantly, this is your own game, and so you're eager to know how well you're going to play, which makes the correct answer stick like glue regardless of whether you got it right or wrong. And this is way better than starting to read a new chapter half asleep only to forget about it 5 minutes later. But be careful, because this technique works best when you're just one step away from grasping the concept. Any further and your brain might give up because it's too lost to keep trying. For a fun example, next time you're at a social gathering or a party and you see someone you don't know, instead of asking your friends who that was, find out their first initial and try to guess their name. Adding a time limit or limiting your tries makes it more fun and helps in cementing the real name in your head. Now let's combine everything to create the reliable learning process that ensures lifelong retention. This is how it looks. Whenever you're about to learn something new, stop for a second and guess what it could be about, or if it's a problem, how it could be solved. Then when you do read or hear the explanation for it, immediately link it to one thing that you're familiar with. It could be as simple as the previous lesson in the book, or you could go as creative as you possibly can. The next step is to repeat what you just learned a few times in your head until you can recall or paraphrase it out loud once without looking. Finally, use the schedule you created with the help of ChatGPT to actively recall the information at different times. The number of retrieval sessions and the intervals between them depends on how much you value the topic. Everything is explained in greater detail in the book, along with a few additional techniques and in-depth examples for better understanding. I'll leave the link down below if you're interested in getting it, and I would recommend you especially focus on chapter 8 if you end up doing so. But what we talked about so far is enough to get you remembering everything you learned for life. It's how I personally keep the identity-defining ideas I get sticking with me. And if you want to learn the one that only takes 7 seconds to change your life, then click this video right here. And until next time, stay safe.